Well before this 19th century church was built, Timothy Edwards came to what was East Windsor in 1694, the same year he graduated from Harvard. However, at that point, there was no pulpit. Those who farmed the east side of the Connecticut, such as Captain Thomas Stoughton, still had to ferry themselves by canoe to Windsor for church.
Welcome to our series, exploring the life and thought of Jonathan Edwards. I'm Christian Cuthbert, Edwards scholar and pastor, and I'll be your guide to exploring Edwards. In this episode, we'll explore young Jonathan's childhood. When his father Timothy did receive a pulpit, it stood right here. As Stiles tells us in his History of Ancient Windsor, the meeting house stood upon the crest of a sandy knoll in the northeast corner of the old burial ground.
Even with a stroll down Main Street in what is South Windsor today, we can see that this has remained a farming community. As Ola Winslow states, Timothy was a minister his neighbors would have known in his second best clothes. By all accounts, Timothy displayed uncommon intellect and was known for his ability to teach, but he never received the same recognition his son would as an intellectual.
This house, built by Richard Edwards for his minister son, was dismantled in 1813. Jonathan's great-great-grandson, Serrano Dwight, described the house from his own experience.
It was a severely plain, two-story structure of moderate size, built low to the ground and with a second story projecting slightly beyond the first. A single chimney separated the two first-floor rooms, one of which was the kitchen living room, possibly also a bedroom as the family increased. The other, called by Timothy Edwards the parlor, was really the schoolroom.
This structure would not only serve as a place of rest, but as a schoolhouse as well. As minister, Timothy was charged with the education of many of East Windsor's children. And rumor has it that Harvard and Yale thought Timothy's tutelage was so thorough they didn't even need to examine the students for admission. Education was of central importance for Timothy. It was critical to piety. Timothy's daughters received an education more progressive than what was typical for their day, but it was Jonathan that still bore the weight of his father's academic expectations. Young Jonathan was taught to love God in the home and to discover God in the world around him. Timothy would take Jonathan into the woods behind his house, and they would talk together and pray together. From there, they could see the Windsor steeple. They could see the whole Connecticut River Valley. This preserved land, the Forest Village open space, provided the landscape for many of young Jonathan's adventures.
No wonder the beauty and majesty of nature stamped themselves unforgettably on his early thought. In such a setting, nature would have been the most important daily fact to a sensitive child. With a horizon in all four directions, he could have hardly escaped impressions of a spacious world, a world of meadows, unending forests, the river, a world of ever-changing beauty, not a world of man's making.
Both the parlor and the forest became Jonathan's classroom, but his formal education was interrupted when he was about 8 years old. In 1711, Timothy was called away from the farms along the banks of the Connecticut River to serve as chaplain during Queen Anne's War. In yet another colonial conflict between Protestant Britain and Catholic France, Timothy marched off to Albany, leaving young Jonathan the man of the house and entrusting his education to his older sisters. Now, Jonathan was the only son among Timothy's 60 feet of daughters. But from his correspondence, it's clear that he forged an especially strong relationship with his older sister Mary. While in college, Jonathan wrote to Mary, "I assure you that the distance of place does not detract at all from my affection to you." Now, Timothy returned home early from war with an illness that almost took his life, and he resumed his pulpit with a renewed vigor. Timothy's brief absence taught young Jonathan that they live in a land of conflict, and oftentimes people have to leave their farms and their families to go fight for the British Protestant identity. We're here outside First Congregational Church in what's now South Windsor, Connecticut. While this building dates to over 150 years after Timothy began his ministry here, it still hosts the same historic congregation that young Jonathan belonged to. Now, Jonathan's education didn't just happen in the parlor or the forest. It happened in the meeting house as well. When Jonathan was young, the East Windsor congregation experienced revival, an unusual outpouring of the Holy Spirit centered on conversion, which raised concern for religion. Young Jonathan wrote to his older sister Mary,
"Through the wonderful mercy and goodness of God, there hath in this place been a very remarkable stirring and pouring out of the Spirit of God, and likewise now is, but I think I have reason to think, it is in some measure diminished, but I hope not much. About 13 have been joined to the church in an estate of full communion. I think there comes commonly on Mondays above 30 persons to speak with Father about the condition of their souls."
Let's look at the various elements Edwards includes in his letter. First, he notes that a revival is a remarkable stirring. It's something that goes beyond the normal operation of a church. Second, Edwards noted that revivals tend to wax and wane. They tend to come and go. Edwards observed this throughout his ministry, and it would inform his preaching and even his framework for history. Third, Edwards observed that revival adds believers to a full state of communion. Some are added to the church while others are not. And fourth, Edwards observed that revival produces an overall concern for spiritual matters. Behind me is Staunton Brook, which used to run through the property of Captain Thomas Staunton, a cousin of Timothy Edwards. While Jonathan had 10 sisters, he had several neighboring boy cousins. They turned the local woods, swamps, and farms into their playground, and religion became the subject of childhood play and imagination because it was central to the life of the community. When Jonathan's father returned from war, the awakenings of East Windsor caused Jonathan concern for his soul, but he didn't consider this concern saving.
I had a variety of concerns and exercises about my soul from my childhood, but had 2 more remarkable seasons of awakening before I met with that change, by which I was brought to those new dispositions and that new sense of things that I have since had. The first time was when I was a boy, some years before I went to college, at a time of remarkable awakening in my father's congregation. I was then very much affected for many months and concerned about the things of religion and my soul's salvation, and was abundant in duties. I used to pray 5 times a day in secret, and to spend much time in religious talk with other boys, and used to meet with them to pray together. I experienced I know not what kind of delight in my religion. My mind was much engaged in it, and had much self-righteous pleasure, and it was my delight to abound in religious duties. I, with some of my schoolmates, joined together and built a booth in the swamp in a very secret and retired place for a place of prayer. And besides, I had particular secret places of my own in the woods, where I used to retire by myself, and used to be from time to time much affected. My affections seemed to be lively and easily moved, and I seemed to be in my element when engaged in religious duties. And I am ready to think many are deceived with such affections, and such a kind of delight as I then had in religion, and mistake it for grace.
Even though these experiences fell short of saving experiences, they provided Jonathan a template for understanding religion. True religion was a heart religion. True religion required a permanent change in the things one loves, desires, and pursues. As George Marsden states, even after his boyish religious experiences proved ephemeral, Jonathan remained fascinated by the eternally momentous question of conversion.
This is the grave of Timothy Edwards, his wife Esther, and Jonathan's sister Jerusha. Timothy would actually outlive his son by a couple of months. However, Jonathan would outshine his father by reputation. The East Windsor awakenings, the Edwards parlor, the forest and swamps, the meeting house's family, all of these experiences informed young Jonathan's understanding of religion and the world. His college experience would deepen and expand this understanding, the subject of our next video.
Thank you for joining us as we explore Edwards.